Okay, hello. This is me again, and I'm talking to Luke White. Luke White is a lecturer in, I think, visual culture and film and cultural studies at Middlesex University. And Luke, you have a new book coming out at the end of this month, which is what, April 2020, and it's Legacies of the Drunken Master: Politics of the Body in Hong Kong Kung Fu Comedy Films. And I've been lucky enough to have a sneak preview. I haven't read the whole thing yet. I mean, obviously, I've just searched through it for my own name. Um, but I wonder if you could tell us first of all, it's like the story of the book. Why did you choose this
Why
topic?
Kung Fu comedy film? I guess for me, when I started writing it, lots of the 1960s bloody Shaw Brothers heroic movies with lots of people dying heroically, and I was kind of sort of thinking, yes, this is it. This is the good stuff. And then I was kind of sort of thinking about how, in a lot of ways for me, my sort of first encounter with martial arts cinema was actually, it was Jackie Chan. You know, sort of as a teenager, watching a Jackie Chan movie. I think my girlfriend's brother was watching it and it's like, what is this? You know, and there's just kind of the incredible sort of physical virtuosity. It was just kind of a real sort of, it was like sort of, wow, I'd never seen anything like it before. And I was kind of sort of thinking that actually there's a lot that's been written about sort of heroic martial arts films. And they're relatively easy, I think, to legitimize as kind of being important because they're sort of, they have this sort of link to kind of a sort of a militant sensibility, to rebelliousness, you sort of think about the way that, Bruce Lee, who you're an expert in, he's kind of very much sort of taken up as this sort of icon of kind of rebelliousness, of to an extent of sort of, the kind of the assertion of ethnic identity and of sort of Chineseness at a time when that was very much sort of, within sort of global culture was denigrated. And so in a sense, he's very much sort of taken up by a lot of people as kind of being kind of serious and important because of that sort of, way that he connects to, I guess, kind of a counterculture, to rebellion, to a kind of a politics of identity that his films can sometimes be associated with. And in a lot of ways, it sort of became really interesting to me that, if you like, the sort of the serious and heroic martial arts films are often, they're legitimated in that way, and they're written about quite a lot. Relatively, there's very little about kung fu comedy films. They're sort of, they tend to be much more kind of dismissed, to be sort of seen as politically trivial. And a lot of writers, when they have written about them, they kind of interpret them primarily as being, if you like, sort of accommodated to the new conditions of capitalism in sort of late 20th century society, and Hong Kong as a sort of a pioneer of that. So Leon Hunt, for example, in his kind of really good book,
Kung Fu Cult Masters, yeah.
Kung Fu Cult Masters.
Yeah,
I was just turning around to look at my bookshelf to remember what it's called. He talks about the ways that, the sort of the flexible body in the Kung Fu film and Kung Fu comedy is like, it's sort of an analogue of the sort of the flexibility of kind of the postmodern globalized flexible accumulation and capitalism sort of requires of us. And in a sense, that's kind of a sort of a discourse that's kind of gone right back into sort of the ways that those films were sort of understood since the 1980s. But in a way, I think they're very interesting films, and it's a shame that they're not written about more, because they're also a kind of an incredibly globally significant kind of cultural phenomenon. So if you like, in terms of, I think you'll probably disagree with me in terms of kind of, how you might measure stardom. But if you sort of think about the Bruce versus Jackie sort of thing, like on the one hand, Bruce has kind of produced this enormous sort of outpouring of fandom and books and even kind of scholarly work. But whilst Jackie Chan hasn't done that, in terms of kind of sheer numbers of films sold, his films have outsold Bruce Lee, and in a sense, he's the character who, in a way, fulfilled that promise of being the kind of the global kung fu star in across global sort of culture that that Bruce Lee possibly could have been if he lived longer and made more films. But in a sense, it's the kung fu comedy that's become this kind of global form. And I you know, in a sense, I wanted to sort of explore what they are more and sort of think more about, you know, what their qualities are and whether there is a sort of an interesting politics to them beyond just being kind of, you know, kind of capitalist stuff, I guess.
Okay, well, I'm sharing the table of contents. So, I mean, so the chapters, you looks like, you know, you zone in on themes, the carnivalesque, utopia, questions of violence, hysteria. Masculinity is always the big thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's a theme if you're dealing with like you know, Asian men. I guess there's a tradition in film studies as well, generally to look at issues of gender. And
yeah.
then legacies, and your conclusion is to do with inheritors. So I guess my first question about this is like, is it primarily about Jackie Chan then? Is this just a book about Jackie Chan, or does each chapter zone in on a different actor or a different genre or different, you know, sub or director, or, you know, how is it organized?
It's not just a book about Jackie Chan. Jackie Chan kind of plays a central role in it. So yeah, it's kind of thematically organized, you know, around some of these sort of topics. I think the chapters do kind of tend to zoom in on films. The kind of the title sort of, and the sort of the last sort of chapters around legacies, inheritors, they sort of point to what for me was the organizing principle, was to think about legacies. So in a way, it starts with the film The Drunken Master, which I sort of take as being the film that sort of created the sort of the blueprint for kind of kung fu comedy films. There are kung fu comedies, and the kind of bringing together of kung fu and comedy before this, and in a sense, it's a sort of a tradition that goes right back into you know, Chinese opera, which is often a very kind of comic format. But in a way, Drunken Master and to an extent Snake in the Eagle's Shadow, and they both kind of came out in 1978, were the films that sort of made it a sort of a box office thing, and that then kind of created a sort of an explosion of interest and kind of shifted the kung fu genre much more towards towards kind of comedy films. So, and then what I sort of trace is I trace a kind of real sort of you know, kind of what would you call it, like a sort of a proliferation of genres that come out of that. So I talk to some extent about the you know, there's a whole set of these kind of Drunken Master type films. And then especially in sort of the 80s, there's, you know, the sort of the cop film, the comedy cop film becomes very important. And you also get, in some of the other chapters, I look quite a lot at the sort of supernatural kung fu comedies as well, with sort of the hopping vampire films and stuff like that. And in a way, sort of I move towards the work of Stephen Chow as well, who I write about quite a bit, who's somebody else who I think kind of could be written about more, I think, because he's a really interesting performer. And I think alongside Jackie Chan and Stephen Chow, there's also a lot of, I think the other person that I kind of concentrate on a lot is Yuen Woo-ping as well, who obviously he was the director of the Drunken Master films and a kind of a key figure in those. So if you like, I'm kind of looking at the sort of the legacies, and though the chapters have a sort of a center of gravity, which I think moves increasingly towards the present, that there's an attempt to sort of think about sort of echoes, repetitions, changes, transformations, and they're organized, I think, around that metaphor of legacy, really.
Okay, great. So I mean, why did you choose to organize it in terms of single word titles? So, I mean, for instance, I guess I know that with masculinity, it weighs in on the debate that people have had around the status of Asian male masculinity and Bruce masculinity, and I guess that's probably the starting point for your discussion of Jackie Chan and masculinity. But for instance, what's the main argument in your violence chapter, for example?
Okay, so I mean, I think one of the violence chapters very much about, because if you like the first sort of chapters, Carnival and Utopia, they often kind of show us, in a sense, if we sort of think about the carnival body or the sort of, it's often quite sort of, it's often seen as being quite sort of a utopian sort of form. And I think one of the other ways that it's organised is I often kind of look around particular theorists as well. So obviously with Carnival, I'm looking at Bakhtin. Okay. And then I kind of look further in the second chapter about Utopia. I'm kind of using Walter Benjamin to analyse it. And I think one of the things that, you know, thinking about my experience of sort of seeing those Jackie Chan movies is there's this kind of extraordinary element of kind of a sense of sort of physical liberation that you have when you watch a martial arts film. So there's like a really sort of famous, I don't know if any quote's famous, I've just read it basically, by David Bordwell, when he writes about kung fu films. He talks about this kind of feeling that after you've walked out of a good kung fu movie, it's like even, I think he says, even professors heavy with middle age and polemic feel like they can leap and somersault over the cars in the car park outside the theatre. So that's that sense of sort of liberation when you watch a good kung fu film, which I think, you know, the kung fu comedic body is incredibly mobile, much more than in the other films before it, because it's very much connected to these sort of opera acrobatics as well. So in a sense, those first two chapters, they think about, you know, whether there's kind of an element of sort of fantasy, a utopian fantasy of liberation involved in the kung fu comedy body. But I think we can't forget that these are films about violence as well. So in a sense, the chapter of violence turns around to sort of think about what kind of a representation of violence is involved. And in a way, my kind of argument is that, you know, if we just think about cinematic violence, it can often be taken as in too abstract a way. So we need to think about the particular, you know, the particular quality of violence in particular films. And in a way, what is the difference between the kind of image of violence that you get in a kung fu comedy and the image of violence that you get in, you know, like a Bruce Lee film, or in, you know, the kind of 1960s bloody sword plays by Chang Che and sort of things like that. So, and in a way, I kind of want to sort of interrogate what the sort of the ethics of violence within the kung fu comedy film is. And I think you've chosen probably the most kind of complex and twisted and tortuous chapter in terms of an argument. So I think to really get to the ends of that, you probably have to read the sort of the chapter for I'm not sure I can summarize it in 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, great. So I mean, so you have, so I guess, so you say there's a kind of chronological temporal development and a genre development, but you're also using different theoretical frameworks, I guess, to organize each chapter.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing Hysteria might be there's a psychoanalysis to this, I'm guessing.
That's right. So in the Hysteria chapter, I draw on the sort of psychoanalytical ideas around hysteria. And in particular, I kind of look at the sort of the feminist, the ways that's being reworked through feminism.
Okay.
And I try and sort of think about I try and think about that through thinking about, I try and apply it to a sort of a post-colonial situation, I guess. Yeah. And thinking about, so I mean, there are feminist kind of authors such as Hélène Cixous, who kind of really sort of, they try to sort of, in some sense, if you like, though hysteria is a very problematic term, and it has very problematic questions around gender around it. Cixous tries to sort of, in some sense, rehabilitate the term and sort of think about hysteria as involving a different kind of form of resistance. Mm-hmm. So, and in fact, interestingly enough, that the sort of the idea in Freud of hysterical resistance, is something that is, or of resistance in analysis, if you like, comes from sort of a discussion of what he encounters in his hysterics. So it's a very different kind of resistance from the kind of militant resistance you get with someone like Bruce Lee. But, you know, it becomes a way of sort of thinking, is there another kind of form of resistance, which is like the hysterics resistance to analysis that's involved with it within the sort of the comedy film. And of course, one of the ways that hysteria is often understood is it's where symptoms can't find their way into speech or language or consciousness and become lodged in the body. So for me, it sort of was a very useful metaphor for thinking about the body and bodily performances as being kind of like sort of symptomatic.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Symptom. So is this? I mean, this is something that I've thought. This is a digression away from your book, but
mm-hmm.
is this? Are these symptoms in a bad way? Like symptom as a problem that needs to be somehow therapeutically managed into speech and therefore out of behaviour, or is it symptom like in a more kind of something you should enjoy in the sort of Zizekian like synth kind of a sense?
I think it's kind of both in a way. I mean, in a way, they're obviously a symptom is it's related to something bad that you kind of possibly need to address. But in a sense, I think symptoms are also, when we sort of think about them in terms of hysteria, symptoms themselves are a kind of they're a form of resistance or transformation, and as you say, sort of pleasure, which kind of changes the circumstance.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess I was thinking about it. So the first chapter is about carnival, and one of the sort of the key people who wrote about carnival is Alon White, who kind of wrote along with Peter Stalibras, the sort of the book, the Poetics and Politics of. So I can't remember the name of any book at the tool today, but they wrote this sort of kind of analysis of Bakhtin. Yeah. And Alon White was also actually he suffered from certainly what he diagnosed as being hysteria, and wrote about hysteria as well. And in a sense, he kind of makes a link between carnival imagery and the kinds of imagery that Victorian hysterics kind of wrote about. But in a way, his kind of argument is that within carnival, these images have a sort of a collective form which makes them transformative and healing and cathartic, whereas if you like the individual hysteric, all of that sort of becomes sort of individualized in the Victorian era. So those sort of symptoms recur, but they come back in a sort of a nightmare guise rather than, you know, this sort of this healing ritual of carnival. So maybe the kung fu comedy film is kind of something that's like balance between the two in some kind of a way.
Okay. And speaking of balances between two things in some kind of a way, you write in either the introduction or the acknowledgements that it's not really a film. Well, it's both a film studies book, but it's really more also, or equally connected with issues in cultural theory, cultural studies more broadly. So, I mean, as soon as you talk about the politics of the body, you know, so it's not just about the film, it's also about the body and body practice. But if you say politics and Hong Kong, you're talking about places and times, cultures and societies.
Yeah.
So how do you strike the balance between it being film? I mean, film studies is often kind of cultural commentary as well, isn't it? So how do you walk this line?
It's an interesting way to put it. I mean, in a way, I'd sort of say that I have a slightly uneasy relationship with film studies, and in a way, my background is in sort of visual culture studies, and I think a lot of film studies today, film studies still seems to be somewhat riven by this sort of the post theory debates. Mm-hmm. And I think my sort of grounding is very much around, you know, it's not necessarily the sort of the Saussure, Lacan, Althusser, Barthes stuff that the post theorists sort of hated, but it's a very sort of theory driven book, and I think my
I think that's
research
why
is very
I
business
always I
driven.
always do socio art. Like I just insist on it. It's like you have to do these things. It's like touching your toes, stretching, or running, or press up. You have to do
Yeah.
them.
You know, and so in a sense, I probably have a slightly complicated relationship to it, and I kind of think my work's often more interdisciplinary. It's more related to visual culture studies and to cultural studies, I think. And in a sense, yeah, it's kind of a book about film history, but for me, it's more about the ways that film is related to culture and society, and to Hong Kong and its politics. And it's as much about kung fu bodies as it is about the films, and it's as much about, so in a sense, it's as much about sort of performance and the performing body, and the ways that sort of there's a sort of a bodily culture which is related, I guess, to kind of martial arts culture more broadly as well, and that finds its place across popular culture rather than just being a work about film studies. So in a sense, I suspect a lot of my methodologies aren't necessarily film studies methodologies, and in a way, I don't sort of necessarily have the film as text as kind of being the object of study, I think. So for me, it's a means of thinking about martial arts, about the body and the performing body, and about its relationship to culture, and in particular to Hong Kong culture, and the changing culture of Hong Kong at that time.
That's fab. So it's out this month, April
30th, I believe. Yeah.
And that the pandemic, the lockdown hasn't slowed that down in any way. Are they managing?
Well, as far as I know, I have my advanced copies already. So
so it exists. So it's okay.
It's there, and you can. It's kind of like you can pre-order it on Amazon and like at Blackwell's and Waterstones and stuff like that as well.
And is it ebook format as well, obviously? And
yeah, I mean, I know that Amazon's also advertising a Kindle version already. And I believe, I mean, when I've looked at the publisher's website, it looks like it's hardback only at the moment, but I do believe they're producing an ebook version as well.
So at the moment, it might be order one for your library, and then because if it's hardback, I'm guessing it's pricey, and then hopefully hopefully they can price the Kindle or ebook at a sensible price, like.
Fingers crossed. I mean, at the moment, like I was kind of having a look at it on Amazon, you know, kind of doing that sort of ego googling, as it were, to see what it was. And the other day, basically, the book's I think $68, so Americans are kind of lucky. The prices in the UK seem to go from being kind of like 75 quid down to being, I think, Amazon had it as kind of down to 55 quid for the hardback the other day, and Amazon were doing the Kindle at sort of 20 something.
That's good. That's a good sign.
I'm not sure if that's a special offer or if that's what the price is going to be. But it's the University of Hawaii Press, so I suspect it will be very much in line with the kinds of prices that their other books are coming out at.
Okay, well, that's fabulous. Thank you for talking to us, and we look forward to seeing that in print, and we'll review it in the Martial Arts Studies Journal, and we'll speak to you about it again, I'm sure.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to talk to you, Paul, and stay well.